بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسول الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Okay, we're on a final chapter of this long journey. We've reached the final chapter, the Corpse of India, chapter number 9. Once we finish this chapter, we'll have covered approximately 400 pages of this book in the last week. In the last week, we've been covering the entire book. By the time we finish today's session, we'll have covered the entire 400 pages of this very interesting book of history of South Asia, of India. Okay, so on the 17th of May, 1798, 2 days before Napoleon's fleet shipped out of Toulon and sailed swiftly across the Mediterranean towards Alexandria, a single tall-masted ship, this time a sleek East Indiaman, was tacking into the River Hooghly after 7 months at sea, so coming into India. A man was on the ship who would change the history of India as much as Napoleon would change the history of France. His name is largely forgotten today, unlike some of the other characters that we've been talking about. And in the next 7 years, he would conquer more territory in India more quickly than Napoleon even conquered in Europe. His name was the Governor General, Richard Marquess of Wellesley, and Arthur was his younger brother who had also recently been posted to India and would in time eclipse Richard and be ennobled as the Duke of Wellington. Between them, the two would transform both India and indeed Europe. So he stepped onto Calcutta. He entered Calcutta to succeed our friend Lord Cornwallis as Governor General of the company's possessions in India. So this is our friend Richard coming into Calcutta, Richard Wellesley. He'd come out east with he'd come to India with two very clear goals. One of them was that he wanted to secure India for British rule, and he was determined to oust the French from having any foothold in the subcontinent. So it was really a competition with the French as well. That if the French were to get together with other parties, other groups in India, war would break out, especially if they sided with Tipu Sultan, who we have to finish off with yet as well. So they wanted to get to the French, or they wanted to get to Tipu Sultan before the French arrived to help him, because of course the French were going to help Tipu Sultan out, and they needed to get to Tipu Sultan. They needed to defeat him. They needed to depose him before the French could make their way to India to help him. So Wellesley began drawing up plans to send troops south to take on this threat in where Tipu Sultan was. Now his plans had to be accelerated when he read in a Calcutta newspaper a declaration issued in Mauritius by the island's French governor, and it basically publicized the intention of Tipu to conclude an offensive and defensive alliance with the French, and that he only waits for the moment when the French shall come to his assistance to declare war on the English, whom he ardently wishes to expel from India. So they need to get to Tipu Sultan before the French got to help him. From that moment onwards, really, Tipu Sultan's fate was sealed. Wellesley's priority was now to eradicate all traces of French influence before any French military expedition could arrive to help him. For example, he wrote to his friend General Harris, who was a commander-in-chief in Madras, and he was also a veteran of Cornwallis's campaign against Tipu, that he said, we all need to get together as soon as possible to strike a sudden blow against Tipu before he can arrive or before he can receive foreign aid as well. However, before Wellesley had to deal with Tipu, he also had to deal with someone called Raymond and his French Revolutionary Force in Hyderabad. So there was already some French presence in Hyderabad, and he really needed to deal with them first before he tried to deal with Tipu Sultan as well. And so it was also a challenge because Raymond from the French side was very popular with the Hyderabad court. So they loved him very much. And they supported him a lot, the people in Hyderabad, the army in Hyderabad. However, all of a sudden, on the 25th of March, 1798, Raymond was found dead. He was only 43 years old, and there'd been rumors going around that he'd been poisoned, possibly by someone who was supporting the company, and poisoned him to basically eliminate him. Um, at the same time, the company was able to sign a secret negotiation with the Nizam of Hyderabad. So they were able to neutralize, because the French weren't really a presence anymore after the death of Raymond, and they were able to sign a secret treaty with the Nizam of Hyderabad, who would basically said, he'd join the company in a military alliance. In return, he was also due to pay a company of an annual subsidy as well. So they neutralized the threat from Hyderabad as well. And then, that being dealt with, they quickly circled the French that were there in Hyderabad, and they, after a protracted amount of negotiation, the French accepted their terms and also gave up as well. Within a few hours, the largest French corps in India, more than 14,000 strong, were disarmed by a force of less than a third that number. Not a single shot was fired, not a single life was lost. The French were forced to, the largest army of the French in the subcontinent, were forced to sign a treaty with the English, and subsequently were made to leave as well, before Tipu Sultan could get help from forces coming from the French from elsewhere. 2 hours later, after concluding this deal, they received even better news, that Admiral Nelson had a success in the Battle of the Nile on the 1st of August. He sunk the entire French fleet in a place called Aboukir Bay, which basically wrecked Napoleon's hope of taking Egypt at the time and using Egypt as a launching pad to take over India. So the French had their sights on India, but they'd been defeated in Egypt, which they were going to use to take on India, basically, but they'd been defeated there as well. So they had Hyderabad secured. Napoleon was defeated in Egypt. Now they only had to go after the one adversary that was left, really, besides the Delhi Sultanate, which we'll talk about, the Delhi Shah Alam and the people that were there. But in terms of the real enemy, Tipu Sultan was the only one he had to worry about. They began a process of propaganda against Tipu Sultan. I mentioned before that he was in some ways very much loved by his people. And this is something similar. The author says that this is very similar to more recent Western confrontations with assertive Muslim leaders. Wellesley now stepped up his propaganda against Tipu. So it's interesting that he draws this analogy of how the West oftentimes portrays people that they don't like in a very negative way. And this was something that they'd also done with Tipu Sultan as well. They depicted him as a cruel and relentless enemy, a beast of the jungle, an intolerant bigot with a rooted hatred of Europeans, and who had perpetually on his tongue the projects of jihad. And so they projected this image of him that, look, we're doing Indians a favor by removing this person. Can you see this? Very, very interesting. So he was quite deceptive. He also lied to the company of his plans as well, where they were told really not to engage in warfare. But these people were so greedy, they were engaging in warfare to take over India as well. Anyway, Tipu knew about all of their plans. He knew what the English were doing, and he knew about what the plans were beyond his borders as well. He says, "It has come lately to my ears from report," he wrote, "that in consequence of the talk of interested persons, military preparations are on foot." Tipu tried with equal energy to raise support from the last indigenous armies capable of taking on the company. So he tried with the Hyderabadis to say, you know what, why don't you guys work with me against the English? So, for example, James Kirkpatrick had a report from Hyderabad. Tipu had also written to the Nizam of Hyderabad, begging forgiveness if he had infringed any treaty and asking for an alliance. And he said that the English were determined to extirpate the Muslims and establish hat wearers in their place. So they'd gone to the Marathas, they'd gone to the Hyderabadis to sort of find alliances as well. Now Wellesley was now ready, and there would be no time for Tipu to create alliances. He needed to protect himself, so he really didn't have time to confront or bring negotiations together with people that he might have otherwise found useful, like the Hyderabadis and the Marathas. And so, if you remember, we talked about the previous chapters where one of the advices that Tipu's father gave to him, his father was Hyder Ali, was that he should always keep people on side, right? Keep alliances with other Indian rulers, and if he had done that, he would be sure of victory. But because he was ambitious and self-confident, he ignored his father's advice, which now was going to cost him against the British. So it's always important, perhaps, to listen to what your father is saying as well. However, even though the battle took place between Wellesley and Tipu, Tipu was a formidable opponent. I mean, the British talked about him in terms of how brave he was and how he was a very difficult person to defeat as well. The siege began on the 7th of April, and Tipu was really, really resistant. He refused to bow before them. He refused to give up before them. And Tipu came out fighting. He was killed in a battle eventually, and the city fell into the hands of the company. Tipu was made to rest next to his father, immediately given recognized as a Shaheed, a martyr of faith, with full military honors due to his exalted rank. The British, all of whom had during the campaign been force-fed on Wellesley's propaganda that Tipu was a brutal person, was surprised to discover, right? Remember the propaganda, how much people loved him, both Hindus and Muslims, and they had been surprised to see how prosperous his kingdom actually was. He wasn't a brutal person that Wellesley had used as propaganda against him. His kingdom was well cultivated, populous, and industrious as well. So we always hear from history that powerful people use propaganda to wage war against their enemies and exaggerate their enemies, their brutality of their enemies, so as to justify their invasion. Right? This is not something that is sort of like a modern trick. It's a very historical thing that generals and people who are greedy do. They throw people out in harm's way for their own political, financial ends as well. It's interesting here as well, and I want to go back to this palace or this castle in Wales. The cream of Tipu's treasures were later collected by Clive's daughter-in-law. If you remember Clive from before, Henrietta, who's the Countess of Powys Castle, we talked about before, where she had where she made a pleasure trip through southern India in the following year. She was bored by the company of her husband, Edward Clive, the dim new governor of Madras, and she left him to his new job at governor's house while she toured Tipu's former lands of Mysore. So this was the daughter-in-law who was going to take a lot of wealth from Tipu's kingdom. Whenever she came to company cantonment, she found herself surrounded by infantry longing to swap their share of the jewel loot for cash. She was happy to oblige, so she had a lot of money and she was exchanging them for diamonds. In this way, with very little outlay, she casually accumulated one of Europe's most impressive collections of Indo-Islamic art. In due course, it made its way back to the Clive seat of Paris, where it was put on display beside the loot collected 40 years earlier from the Murshidabad Palace of Siraj-ud-Dawla. There it remains. If you want to find it, it's a National Trust site, and we hope you to go there once the lockdown is lifted to visit that place as well, because it's an important historical event, right? The looting of India, and it's all there in a small place, in Wales. Tipu Sultan's sons were dispatched to exile in the fort of Vellore, and most of the best lands of the state of Mysore were divided between the company and the Nizam of Hyderabad, who obviously made a secret agreement with Wellesley as well. So you see this recurring, that people were selling each other out, people were making alliances between themselves. And there's not very much left of the kingdom of Tiger of Mysore now if you go to that part of India. But a lot of people say that he was the single Indian ruler who did more than anyone to resist the onslaught of the company. Lord Wellesley, when the news of Tipu's death had reached him, He held up a glass and he said, "I drink to the corpse of India." This is what he said. In less than 2 years, he managed to disarm the largest French force in India and destroy the second largest. And there were only the French commanded corps of Marathas that stood between him and complete mastery of India. And this conflict was inevitable anyway. But the Marathas were too busy fighting amongst themselves as well, as we see in the book as well. So he basically felt that he could turn the Marathas, make a deal with them, just like he made a deal with the Nizam of Hyderabad, and bring them together as well. They didn't trust the Marathas, although they signed a sort of agreement, but it was called a Treaty of Bassein, and they weren't convinced that the Marathas will fulfill this treaty with them. And there was a person called Baji Rao, who will come back to later on, that they felt that wasn't from the Marathas wouldn't be someone that they can trust. In fact, within months of signing that treaty with the Marathas, they were armed against. They were once again going to end up fighting with the Marathas, who were the last people they really needed to defeat before they really took hold of India. There's one person we haven't finished with, and that's the Emperor Shah Alam, right, who had his eyes gouged out, and he'd gone through a lot of difficulty. He sat as a blind king in the replica peacock throne amongst his ruined palace, and the sightless ruler of a largely illusory empire. This was the last person of really the Mughal dynasty. He'd outlived, ironically, most of his enemies: Nader Shah, Imadul Mulk, Clive, Karnak, Sujad-ud-Dawla, Ghulam Qadir. And this was really his only victory, that he'd outlived all his enemies. Besides that, he hadn't really achieved much else as well. So he was merely a high-class prisoner, if you like. And he wasn't really much more than that as well. He spent a lot of his life towards the end engaged in writing books, literary products. For example, he wrote a book called the Ajaibul Qasas. He wrote a few other books which talk about, which kind of like talk about the fate that affects helpless princes as well. Anyway, so Shah Alam was there. Now the company realized that it was useful for them to use Shah Alam as a puppet emperor, as you've seen before as well. So he didn't have any army, he didn't really have any significance, but he possessed symbolic authority, right? So people were more likely to listen to him as well. So even the coins were still being struck in the name of Shah Alam, even though he really didn't have any power. The company was running the show in reality. And so the Marathas had there were treaties drawn up between the Marathas and others, and it became clear that Marathas weren't going to fulfill their treaty with them. So, for example, one of the persons that was involved in the treaty was someone called Scindia at the Treaty of Bassein, and the war was inevitable. So Wellesley began to draw battle plans against them to invade Hindustan and seize both the capital, Delhi, and the emperor as well. And really, this is when a company, symbolically at least, and in substance, came to replace the Mughal Empire and the Marathas as the paramount rulers of India. So it was only the Marathas that were in their way. Unfortunately for them, they'd be too busy fighting amongst themselves. So they were the last resistance. Tipu Sultan's gone, the French are more or less gone, and there's only the Marathas left as well. And so this was a lot of fighting took place between the Marathas and the East India Company. The East India Company was also successful for one key reason, and that was they were able to raise a lot of money very, very quickly for war. And that was one of their success stories, that they were able to secure finance from people, financiers, very, very quickly when it came to war as well. And Wellesley also was very, very clever in keeping the Marathas away from being united, right? So, he adopted the old maxim of divide and rule. and he keeps Scindia and Holkar from reconciling. So these two people who made up the Marathas, he made sure that they were not able to reconcile their differences, because if they were able to do that, they were able to make a formidable army. And then he kind of spread a rumor to Holkar that Scindia had conspired against him with somebody else, with the free with Daulat Rao, that once they defeat the English, he was going to get rid of Holkar. So Holkar basically turned away. So instead of having a triple alliance, there was only two alliances left as well. So this is something to bear in mind as well. And in the end, because Holkar battled away, left the army, he said, "Look, you guys are selling me out." It was only Daulat Rao, Scindia, that was left in the end to fight against the British. And they declared war against the East India Company. So Scindia and Daulat Rao were the final ones to fight the British. They were defeated, and that pretty much signaled the end of the rule of India in many ways as well. So at midnight on the 1st of September at the Kutub Minar, which is in Delhi, it's ironic because that was built in the 12th century as a sign of the establishment of Islamic rule in India. And a massive earthquake had come where the top story of that minar had collapsed. And many buildings were toppled, many buildings were destroyed as well. And there were holes in the ground, there were cracks and fissures in the ground as well. Shah Alam knew this was a sign. Shah Alam interpreted that, look, this is the end of Delhi, this is the end of the Mughal Empire as well. And he realized that the company was really in ascendancy, and he decided that he would open negotiations with the company. So he was no longer looking toward the Marathas to defend Delhi, and he basically he started writing letters privately to the East India Company as well. And the East India Company obviously saw this to their advantage because they wanted to keep him as a puppet emperor as well. So he covertly reached out to Wellesley, while he outwardly looked like he was supporting the few French soldiers that were there, and the Marathas. And he basically sold out to them as well. And so he felt that, look, all that's left for me is really to maintain my kingdom and maybe make a relationship with the East India Company as well. So the Battle of Delhi was the last time the British troops faced French troops in South Asia, and it ended a century of rivalry, which had caused so much bloodshed, mostly of non-Europeans. So although a lot of the battles were between the French and the British for South Asia, the real casualties were the indigenous people of India. Okay, and it brought, in some ways, this battle between the French, the Marathas, and East India Company really brought a close to Hindustan's unhappy century of being fought over. People were fighting over the carcass of India, if you like, which was being plundered by rival armies. And people said, once the East India Company took over, now we have some peace. And he says here, the deer lies down with the leopard, the fish with the shark, the pigeon with the hawk, the sparrow with the eagle. Khairuddin says that he was writing this obviously to flatter his patrons, but there was a measure of truth that after the horrors of the Great Anarchy, as the book is called, the next 50 years will be remembered as the Golden Calm. And this also, the Battle of Delhi, decided the future fate of India. The Marathas were the last indigenous Indian power that was militarily capable of defeating the company and driving it out of South Asia. So the Marathas were the last ones to resist after Tipu Sultan, and they'd been defeated as well at Delhi as well. And everybody within India knew that a major revolution had taken place. Many Muslims, for example, led by the Delhi Imam Shah Abdul Aziz, saw this as a moment that India had slipped out of their hands for the first time since the 12th century. From here to Calcutta, he says, the Christians are in complete control, he wrote in an 1803, in a fatwa written in 1803 on jihad. India is no longer Darul Islam. Company officials realized with equal clarity, we are now complete masters of India. and nothing can shake our power if we take proper measures to confirm it. So the British had now gained supremacy over India. There were a few things such as the Great Uprising, the Mutiny, 1857. That's another important chapter in the history of India. And I leave that for another book. We'll go through that in another book. The Great Uprising in 1857. For better or for worse, India remained in British hands for another 144 years, finally gaining its freedom only in 1947. So it's only recently in sort of history where India gained its freedom as well. So the conquest of Delhi was a very significant moment. It was really, so much was fought over, so much blood was shed for India. The company understood the importance of infiltrating the Mughal system rather than simply blowing it apart or abolishing it. So unlike previous Nawabs or people or princes who sort of killed people or leaders, the British understood the importance of maintaining those leaders, even if they were puppets, because they were very, very useful in legitimizing their activities as well. However, in 1803, a decision had been taken. The company was now to be recalled by the government. The government prevailed over the company. There was growing opposition in Parliament to the existence of the company in 1825, and in 1833, Parliament took action. They passed the East India Company Charter Bill, which would remove the company's right to trade and so turned it into a sort of governing corporation. Okay. In fact, in 1857, their own armies, right, the mutiny, rose up in revolt against the company. So soldiers, and there's a whole history behind what happened there. Muslims and Hindus rose up against the company. They crushed this rebellion. The company distinguished itself for a final time by hanging and murdering many tens and thousands of suspected rebels in the bazaar towns that line the Ganges. So this is a lot of important recent history, and for many of us living in the West, especially those of us who have South Asian heritage, like myself, we really need to know this. It's really important that we know our history. Probably the bloodiest episode in the entire history of British colonialism. This was only recently, in the aftermath of the Great Uprising, the Indian mutiny, as it is known in Britain, or the First War of Independence, as it's called in India. So they would call it the War of Independence. Parliament finally removed the company from power altogether. It was like, we've had enough with you guys. You've been looting India. We're going to take over. Remember, though, like I mentioned right at the beginning, a lot of MPs had a lot of money invested in this company as well. So it wasn't exactly a distinction between the company and the government. Enough was enough. The Victorian state, alerted to the dangers posed by corporate greed and incompetence, successfully tamed history's most voracious corporation. The company's navy was disbanded and the army was passed on to the crown. In 1859, as it was within the walls of Allahabad Fort, the same place where Clive had first turned the company into an imperial power by signing the Diwani, if you remember, and that the Governor General, Lord Canning, formally announced that the company's Indian possessions would be nationalized and passed into the control of the British Crown. Queen Victoria was in charge rather than the directors of the company, and she would be the ruler of India. There's a lovely book. Maybe one day, if people are interested, I could go through it, about this relationship she had with one of her servants who was a Muslim, right? There's a book that's been recently written on that. So maybe we could cover that at some point in the future. Interestingly, the brand name East India Company is now owned by two brothers from Kerala who use it to sell condiments and fine foods from a showroom in London's West End. So you can go there and you can find it there. But this is 400 pages that we've covered in a week of this book, of the history of the East India Company in India. I'm thinking about which book I should do next. I'll try to cover an ambitious target of a book every week. Please do get in touch. Let me know which book you want me to cover. Please do share this video if you find it useful. If you think I should do more of this, please do let me know. There is an epilogue at the end. There's a little bit of a discussion at the end. What I'm going to do, inshallah, is write this up at the end. So just some of my own reflections on reading this book. This is a book that we've covered all 400 pages for you. We've covered it over an entire week. I hope you find it useful. We'll do some more videos. Let me know which book I should do next. And I'll see you all very, very soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.